Hello, language arts folks. I wanted to say hi and congratulations on making it to Module 7, our module on poetry. You guys have been doing great work this semester, and I hope you are feeling proud of all the learning that you've done. We are almost ready to be done, but not before we talk about the importance of poetry. I wanted to give you a couple of examples. I know the Tompkins book gives you some, and I've given you some examples to look at, and so I hope you click on those links. You'll need to do that for the discussion board. And the performances that the kids give in those videos are really, really awesome, so I hope you like those. I wanted to show you a couple other examples of poetry that I have found really useful in instruction with kids, and then maybe do a little bit of a read aloud of some, because poetry really is meant to be performed and heard. So just a couple examples. A book that I love that my former students used to love is called Meet Denitra Brown by Nikki Grimes. It's about this little girl and some of her just things that happened in her life. So really an image of childhood and some things that she likes in poems that are about those things. You can also do an introduction to more classic forms of poetry. I love this book, A Kick in the Head. It actually describes the different forms of poetry. So I don't know if you can see this. So this page says couplet up here in the corner. Where is it? There it is. And then it gives a little bit of it gives a brief definition. It says a couplet is a two-line poem or stanza, usually rhyming. And then it gives an example of a couplet from the canonical poetry. So here it says, "In the world of mules, there are no rules," which is The Mule by Ogden Nash. Okay. And so you have that kind of an approach for a whole wide variety of poems. So for instance, here's a tanka poem, and it says, "A tanka is a 5-line cousin of the haiku. The accented syllables are usually counted, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3. And then it gives an example. Okay. So fabulous poetry, fabulous formats, really helpful structure for you and for your students as they learn about a whole variety of forms of poetry. Also in terms of classic poetry and canonical poetry, there are some really good books that sort of re-envision poetry for children. So for instance, this is a book based on a Langston Hughes poem, My People, but it's been put to photographs and artwork by this illustrator, this photographer, Charles Smith. Right, so beautiful also are the souls of my people, right? And so you have this Langston Hughes poem in a much more accessible format with photographs that sort of bring to light some of the lives that the poem is talking about. So, something to look into. You can have poetry that is about particular topics, right? So sometimes poetry can be a good place to do curricular integration, especially if we think about poetry as just wordplay, sort of think of it broadly. This is a book I love called Mathematicals, and you can see that it uses words and math symbols and concepts to create poetry. So here's one that says sphere plus sphere plus sphere equals snowman. Right. Where's another one I like? Here's one. Pumpkin patch multiplied by sunlight equals orange. Right. So they're using the ideas and the symbols of math to say something in a sort of poetic form. Right. Douglas Florian is a really good poet for children, especially when it comes to integrating science concepts. So here's a book of poetry on comets, stars, the moon, and Mars. But he has a whole variety of other poems about animals, about plants, about trees, about seasons, and really lovely poems for kids with excellent artwork in his books. So check out Douglas Florian. You can also have social studies integration. Particularly if you're interested in some of the social justice topics that we've been talking about and using literacy for social action. You have an optional article in this module to read called Taking Walks Talking Walls, Presenting a Case for Social Justice Poetry in Literacy Education. It's an article from the reading teacher, and if you were interested in some of the things we talked about around the Tyson article and social action, you can see how you can think about those same kinds of ideas when it comes to reading and writing poetry. Another example of that would be a book like this, We Troubled the Waters by Nzitoke Shange. She's a playwright and poet. And this is dedicated to the Little Rock Nine, right, the group of students who integrated schools in Little Rock. And so a whole variety of poems about the civil rights movement and about the fight for racial equality. And really, really lovely artwork and lovely poetry. So check out We Troubled the Waters. One other thing that you might not think of when we talk about poetry is that there's actually books that are written in verse, right? There's whole books are written poem after poem after poem instead of chapter after chapter after chapter. Two of my all-time favorites. I love books in verse. I just love, love, love them. They are often very emotive and expressive. They're often very engaging. And they tell a lot of story in not a lot of words, which may be contrary to my wordy videos. I actually really enjoy. I really think when authors choose their words so carefully to create so much understanding and story and impact for you as a reader, I think it's really powerful. So here are two favorites of mine. Love That Dog by Sharon Creech, just wonderful. And I actually, I recently got a dog, and I now have my own little yellow dog, so I don't know that I can read this book anymore, but it's wonderful and emotional, and it's actually about a student who is learning about poetry, hates poetry, and is learning about poetry in school. So it's how he kind of comes to understand the power of poetry, and it's all about his dog. It's really, really good. She has a second one out called Hate That Cat and a couple others. But probably my favorite book, besides Don't Let the Pigeon Drive the Bus, my favorite book of all time is Jaclyn Woodson's Locomotion. It's absolutely phenomenal. Also written in verse. Extremely powerful. It's about a little boy named Lonnie who's in foster care because his parents have died in a fire, and about his journey through foster care and his journey to actually also become a poet, right? To learn from his teacher about poetry, to find out the voice he has and the things that he wants to share with the world, and how he starts to understand those things and communicate those things. It's just really, really beautiful. Anything by Jaclyn Woodson, I'm a fan. Excuse me. Another one of those books is a book that I'd like to read a little bit to you. We'll see how much I end up reading. But this book is by Joyce Sidman, and she writes excellent books in verse. And this is called This Is Just to Say. And the subtitle is Poems of Apology and Forgiveness by Joyce Sidman. And this book is really interesting because it's set up, part one says apologies, and there's this list. And then part 2 says responses. See that? And it's set up, let's see if it explains it. Here it says the introduction. It is my job to write an introduction to this book. First of all, I am Anthony Kay, 6th grader at Florence Scribner School, and this is part of a poetry unit we have completed in Mrs. Mertz's class. We liked our sorry poems so much that we decided to put them together into a book. We worked on them and revised them a lot. Sound like the writing process? Then I had the idea of making a second part, which is why I have to write the introduction, where the people we wrote poems to get to write poems back in response. So there are 2 sets of poems in this book, apologies and responses, plus the poem that inspired them all, This Is Just to Say, by William Carlos Williams, who must have had some interesting nicknames in school. Bao Vang, who is really good at art, took our poems and made the illustrations with the help of Mr. Willow, the art teacher, using her own sketches and some computer art. I learned a lot from this experience, although I can't say that all my classmates feel the same way. And I can't say all the people writing poems back felt great about it either. Some of them didn't even do it. So a few of us on the editorial board had to fill in. Because of this book, though, a bad thing that was going to happen didn't, and a mystery was solved. So at least to us, this is a pretty important book. We hope you enjoy reading our poems. As Mrs. Mertz says, there's a little bit of us in each of them. Anthony K., editor. So that's the setup of this book. That's how this author is choosing. She's writing as this classroom of students who have been writing poems. So again, we get that meta layer, right? It's sort of poetry about poetry. And so here's the canonical poem, right? The famous poem, historical poem that has inspired this classroom in the story to write poetry. It's called This Is Just to Say by William Carlos Williams. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet, and so cold. So here's part one, apologies. To Mrs. Garcia in the office. This is just to say, I have stolen the jelly donuts that were in the teacher's lounge, and which you were probably saving for teachers. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so gloppy. Too bad the powdered sugar spilled all over my shirt and gave me away. By Thomas. So can you see how the students, the characters in the story, are using that first poem as a mentor text, right? They're looking at it, they're taking the structure and some ideas, and then incorporating their own thoughts into that structure, right? So that's our first apology poem. Here's another. To the statue of Florence P. Scribner. Now remember, they're at Scribner Elementary School. Lucky nose. I am very sorry for assaulting your nose before every spelling test. When I first came here, I noticed you right away. Your kind eyes, your stiff hair rolled in a ball, like my grandmother's. Your nose looked so strange and magnificent. I asked Mei Li about it. Pale and smooth from 1,000 rubbings, she said. Before that first spelling test, it felt like a cool stone under my hand, calming me. In 100 years, your nose may be worn down to nothing, and so I am very sorry. But think of all the little children, again and again, to whom you gave that cool stone of luck. By Bao Vang. To Kyle. I got carried away. Kyle, I'm sorry for hitting you so hard in dodgeball. I just really get carried away in situations like that. Kids screaming and ducking, coach bellowing, all those red rubber balls thumping like heartbeats against the walls and ceiling, blinking back and forth like stoplights that really mean go, go, go. See, I even got carried away in this poem. By Ruben. To Ruben. Dodgeball crazy. Sorry, Rubes, for belting you as hard as I could in dodgeball. I'd like to say I wouldn't do it again, but I'd be lying. By Kyle. To Mrs. Mertz, Fashion Sense. I am so sorry for my rude words. The classroom was so dead. No one had anything more to say about Old Yeller, and we were all crazy to get outside. The silence seemed like 100 crushing elephants. So I raised my hand and made that comment about your dress, and everyone burst out laughing. You smiled, but your smile looked like a frozen pond. People were high-fiving me on the way down to lunch, but I felt like a traitor. You know how the words slip out and you can't believe it, and they echo in your head forever and ever? All through lunch, all through recess, all the next day, I wished I could take those words back. I kept thinking of what you always say to us. Words can help or hurt. The choice is ours. I want to rewind that moment and say instead, Mrs. Mertz, that dress makes you look like a princess. You are really a queen, not a princess. Our queen, Reina de la Casa. I hope you will overlook the transgressions of your loyal but loudmouth subject, and forgive me. P.S. I notice you're not wearing that dress so much anymore. Green is not good on you anyway. I like the new one with blue in it, which makes you look thinner. By Carmen. To my mom. Brownies, oops. I smelled them from my room, a wafting wave of chocolateness. I listened for a movement, ears pricked like a bat. I crept down, stepped over the sleeping dog. I felt the cold linoleum on my bare toes. I saw the warm, thick brick of brownies. I slashed a huge chunk right out of the middle. The gooey hunks of chocolate winked at me as I gobbled them. Afterward, the pan gaped at me like an accusing eye. My head said, oops, but my stomach said, heavenly. By Maria. To my sister Carrie, the black spot. That black spot on your palm, it never goes away. So long ago I can hardly remember I stabbed you with a pencil. Part of the lead there, still inside you. And inside me, too, something small and black. hidden away. I don't know what to call it. The nugget of darkness that made me stab you. It never goes away. Both marks still there. Small black reminders. By Alyssa. To my dad. Balance. Dad, I'm sorry for smashing the garage window when I was a kid. Philippe and I were messing around and saw the cracked pane. One had a crack, so they should all have a crack, right? That's what Philippe said. We hefted some rocks. Then one pane had a jagged hole, but they all had to match, right? Philippe said we should balance them out. I remember the weight of the gritty rocks, the shiver of the tinkling glass, the wild joy booming in my chest, the fear, the running away. For a while it seemed like the bravest thing I had ever done. Now I realized Philippe was stupid to make up a reason to smash things. And I was even more stupid to follow him. By Jose. Okay, so it goes on. Oh, here's one by, this next one is by Mrs. Mertz, the teacher, which I think is interesting. To my mother. Sparkling deer. Mom, I'm so sorry for breaking your precious glass deer all those years ago. The scent of Christmas was in the air, and your little snow scene drew me like a magnet. The deer's slim pink legs and arching neck, I could almost feel their smooth, delicate surface. In my head, I heard you say, "Don't touch," but my fingers had a mind of their own. I plucked it from its rough cotton snow by its tiny antlers. Then it dropped. Later, when I heard you crying, I felt small. Please forgive me. Right, so the teacher is writing too. So it goes on. Maria writes to Bobby. Ricky writes to the hamster that he accidentally set free and then died. Tenzin writes to Einstein, his dog, right? It just sort of goes on and on. There's a mystery one, some different forms. And then we have part 2 responses, and I'll read just a few of those. So what happens is you'll see them match up, right? So here's to Thomas, called Dear Thomas. It's by Mrs. Garcia in The Office. Remember the first poem we read? Dear Thomas, thank you for your poem. You do have a way with you, Thomas. Oops, where is that? It's this page. You do have a way with you, Thomas, smiling, asking me how I'm doing today, talking a mile a minute, slipping in and out. Yes, I see you. Stealing our hearts and our donuts, too. A nice boy like you can really get on in the world if he doesn't let his fingers run away with him. Of course I forgive you, but I still have to call your mother. By Mrs. Garcia in The Office. To Val Vang, to the girl who rubs my nose. I was a child like you. I used to run. I used to play. Now I am old and cold and frozen on my pedestal. I see a lot from up here. Children laughing, crying, fighting, holding hands. I have lots of time to think. I think maybe spelling isn't so important. Friends are important. Kindness is important. A gentle touch. So come rub my nose again, little girl. Come warm me up a little. By Duran, writing for Florence P. Scribner's statue. So you hear how the poems go, the apologies and the responses. The dodgeball boys write a poem in 2 voices, back and forth. Here's a haiku for Carmen by Mrs. Mertz. Just these few warm words, and spring sunlight fills the room. My dress turns to sky. So if you read all of these poems, it's just lovely. The emotional tone really builds. You start to understand the kind of dynamics that are going on in the classroom. And it really gets me every time. There's some really emotional parts in here. But it's really lovely. So I just think that a book like this, books in verse like these, or some books of compilations of poetry are really good ways to encourage children's self-expression, to think about using words in ways to really communicate meaning, to communicate emotions, and to communicate ideas in a way that's ironically perhaps a little bit more accessible. Even if kids are scared of poetry, sometimes the simplicity of it and the conciseness of it is actually a really good entry for students, rather than saying, write 5 pages about, or give me paragraphs on this. How can you break ideas down into lines and into syllables? Social networking, ironically, gives kids a lot of practice with this. Right? How do you tweet something? What's a Facebook status kind of message of things? So kids are getting more and more used to that conciseness, I think. But do remember to include poetry in your classroom as read-alouds, as mentor texts for writing, as independent writing, or reading rather, and yeah, as ways to integrate subject areas. It's a really, really powerful tool, and one that I hope you will not forget that you should teach throughout the year.